Hey beauty friends, this is Meredith from Beadalon and Artistic Wire, and in this video I'm going to show you how to Viking knit using 2 dowels, some 24 gauge wire, a draw plate, and a beading awl. Let's get started. The first thing you'll need to do is make a starter piece. To do that, take your 24 gauge artistic wire or colorcraft wire and pull off about 2 to 2.5 feet from the spool. Use your nippers to cut that piece off. Set your wire aside and wrap that wire around the 0.87 inch or 22.2 millimeter dowel 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's count that to make sure I did it right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Looks like I have 7. So let's back one off and carefully pull that off the dowel. Squeeze it over your index finger and use that long tail to wrap around the middle. Next thing you'll do is make 6 petals or loops by pulling down the loops that you just made. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You can pull those tails out of the way or snip them to make this step a little more manageable. Next, take the 0.37 inch mandrel, the 9.5 millimeter mandrel, and place your flower over top. Now, this step can get a little fiddly, so just take your time and use your thumbs to push each of those loops or those petals down around the top of the mandrel. You might have to go around a couple of times, and this part does not need to be neat or pretty, it just needs to be functional. This will actually all be cut off once you have your piece finished. You could use a rubber band or a piece of tape to hold this starter piece in place, but I find just using my thumb and my forefinger is more than sufficient. Now it's time to get our weave started. Pull off about 2.5 feet of 24, 26, or even 28 gauge artistic wire or colorcraft wire. You want to use a dead soft wire for this project. And put a little bend about 1.5 inches, 2 inches from the end. Now, once again, remember, this first step is not going to be pretty, and it does not have to. This is the functional step. I refer to the first couple of rows as the sacrificial pancake rows, and you don't have to worry about making them neat or tidy. But what you do have to do is take that bend and just hook it into one of those petals on your starter piece. I like to use my thumb and my forefinger to give it a gentle squeeze just to hold everything into place. Now what you'll do is start wrapping clockwise around each of those petals or each of those loops. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to take the end and I'm going to thread it through the next petal around. And as I do that, I want to make sure that my loop comes around not through like it is right now, but over that wire. And the more times you do this around, the clearer it's going to become. So let's do the next one so we can really see what's going on. So I've just gone around through this one. Now I'm going to do that same thing through this one. So I'm coming through from right to left underneath that wire, and I'm pulling it through and around. See how much easier that second one was? Don't get hung up on that first loop not being perfect. This whole row is going to be a little wonky, and everything is going to work out as we go along. Now I'm here for this next loop. I'm going to do that very same thing from right to left. I'm coming through that loop, over the wire on the left, and drawing it through. I'm going to continue doing that all the way around my piece. And I want to make sure that I've done 6 loops. And again, if things get a little wonky, this is not a big deal. It's just going to establish the pattern for our weave. Okay, I'm back around to the beginning. My wire has worked itself around a little bit, and I am now ready to start on the next row. Let's double check and make sure all of my loops are done. Looks like this one is a little bit out of the way. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to do another one right here to make sure all of my loops have a wrap around them. And now I'm ready for the second round. So you can see, not the prettiest thing you've ever made, but once again, can't stress it enough, not a big deal. These are our sacrificial pancake rounds, and they are going to be just fine as we go forward. A very handy tool to keep at your side when you're doing Viking knit is a beading awl, because what you'll find that you sometimes need to do is lift up your loops to get behind them, because that's what we are going to be doing in this next step here. We are going to be wrapping behind each of these loops. So again, with the end of that 24 gauge wire, I'm coming around that loop and drawing my wire through and down and around. So the next one is much easier to see. I'm coming behind that loop, around and down. So that first round is the only round that you're going through the loops on your petals, so to speak. Each successive time you go around, you're going behind that cross, behind that cross in the previous round. So let's continue around, going behind that little X, that little cross made in the previous loop, drawing it tight and moving around. Now, once you get back to the beginning, you might have a little bit of a scrunch up, right? No problem at all. We are using these first couple of rows to establish the pattern. And once again, I'm using my awl just to lift that loop out of the way so I can get behind it and pull my wire through. Now, the great thing about Viking knit is you don't have to worry about a step up. You don't have to worry about keeping your place. You don't have to worry about any continuation of the round. All you need to do is continue going around and around, pulling the wire around the back of those loops until you have run out of wire. And each time it's a little bit fiddly to get behind one of those loops. Just bring your awl in, make a space, and come through. Now, after you've gone around 2 or 3 times, as I have here, it's time to start neatening things up. You have the wire understanding where it wants to go in the pattern, but now we need to make things a little bit neater. And I don't worry about that until I'm around here, because as I said, once you have the pattern established, it's a lot easier to get everything going. If you worry in the very, very beginning about getting everything neat and perfect, you might not get to this point, because the wire wants to go where the wire wants to go. But once you explain to the wire and once you show the wire where you want it to go, it's much more likely that it is going to do what you want it to do. So this is the point that we need to start getting things a little bit more even. We've got some of our rows that are a little bit tighter and some of our rows that are a little bit looser. So when we need to get these a little bit further away and these a little bit closer, that's where your tension starts coming in and starts being more important. So I need to make a nice loose weave right on this one, if I can finagle it through. And these are a couple of the tips that you can use if your wire isn't going where you need it to. You can put a little bend in it. You can use some pliers to pull it through if you need to. But here, I'm going to go a little bit looser on this one right here. And I'm going to pull this loop a little bit tighter. And all that's going to do is start evening up each of my rounds so that when I am ready to pull my finished woven piece through the draw plate, things get a little bit more even. And that's one of the wonderful things about Viking Knit is once you pull your finished piece through the draw plate, many mistakes or many parts of your piece that you might not be as happy about disappear into perfection. And we'll see that as we do that part of our project. But I'm going to continue going around and around. And each time I have a little bit more space here and a little bit less space. You want to make sure you don't do what I just did. Don't go through the center of your loop. You want to always make sure that you're going behind it. Again, the draw plate definitely will cover up a lot of imperfections, but we definitely don't want those imperfections if we can help it. And as you go around, you can see what was a little bit wonky, a little bit not symmetrical, is really starting to take great shape. And after about 5 or 6 rows, your sacrificial pancake rows will have served their purpose and you will be on your way to a wonderfully woven Viking knit piece. Since we're working in smaller lengths of wire, of course we will have to add wire as we go. The reason for working with a smaller length of wire is twofold. First, because we are putting this wire through a lot of motion, we are wrapping it around and around, it is work hardening as we're going from the top to the bottom. Each time we draw this piece of wire around, it's going to work harden. The second reason is because the wire tends to get a little caught up on itself. And I find it much easier to work with a 2 to 2.5 foot piece of wire rather than spend all of my time untangling my wire from itself. But that means that we have to add more wire as we go along. And about every inch or so of Viking knit, you'll have to add another piece of wire. To do that, all you need to do is cut another piece of wire. And just like we did in the beginning, bend that top over at about 1.5 inches, 2 inches. And then hook that wire underneath the last loop. You want your tail and the long piece of wire to be on the same place, as if that new wire is just a continuation of the tail that you used before. Your new tail will just lie right next to that old tail because we're going to weave that in the next 2 or 3 rounds and then snip everything off. Again, once we draw that through the draw plate, you will never know that there is a new wire in there. So I attached my wire and I'm just going to go ahead, and you can see how once the wire is a little bit longer, it tends to get a little bit fiddly. So use the length of wire that you're comfortable with, but I definitely recommend, especially when you're first learning the technique, Go ahead and start with about a 2 to 2.5 foot piece of wire. You will be much happier with your Viking weave process. Once we get around to here, what you want to do is take your working wire behind all of those wires. So we have the tail from our new wire, we have the tail from the old wire, and our working wire is coming behind both the loop and those two tails. And that is what is going to lock everything into place. And I usually do that 2 or 3 times around, and then I'll come in with my nippers and snip those ends off and not even worry about them until it's time for the draw plate. So I've come around, I've locked them in twice. I'm going to lock them in one last time and then take the nippers and snip them off. Sometimes it helps just to raise them up a little bit, especially when I know that this is the time that I'm going to snip them off, because you are, as always, you want to be very careful that you are only snipping those tails of wire off. You're not snipping any of your loops, and you're not snipping any of the base wires. So I'm just going to come in here very carefully and snip those 2 wires as close as I can to my woven piece. And then I will continue with my Viking knit. A couple of things to remember as you are weaving your Viking knit. The first is, as you are weaving down your piece and making it longer as you are adding extra wire, don't weave with your piece and cover your mandrel. What will end up happening is, as you get tighter and tighter and tighter, you could run the risk of having your piece too tight around the dowel, and so you won't be able to remove it at the end. Nobody wants that after you've done all of your work to have it attached to the dowel permanently. So continue to move it up the dowel. This helps give a little bit of extra area for you to hold on to as you are doing your weave, but it also makes sure that you'll be able to remove it easily at the end. Another thing to keep in mind, again, and you can see as we've done this weave around, everything has evened out. So those first couple of very messy rows, we don't need to worry about them, because as you do your weave, everything comes into evenness. You can also see that these rows aren't completely even. Our next step is going to fix everything. So let's get to it. Here we're going to use our draw plate. Because I did my weave and I didn't have it all the way down on my mandrel, I can very easily take it off and set the mandrel aside for next time. I like to make my Viking knit about 3.5 inches. That way I know that it is going to about double when I bring it through all of the different holes in the draw plate. So a 3.5 inch Viking knit piece will yield about 7 inches when I am all finished. And depending on the finished size of your bracelet, you want to do either more or less, or if you're doing a necklace, of course you want to do it even longer. But about a 2-to-1 ratio is a good place to start. Of course, that will change if you are using a different size wire or a different size mandrel to do your weave in. The artistic wire draw plate has inches on one side and millimeters on the other. It does not necessarily matter which side you use, and you don't even have to be consistent. You just have to go from largest to smallest as you are reducing your Viking knit weave. So I like to get some of these wires out of the way before I start drawing through. So I'm just going to snip off my excess wires here, but keep my starter piece on because I'll use that to pull my piece through the draw plate. So I always start with the largest one. Even if it goes through nice and easy, I still always start with that largest one. Now I'm going to move down to the next largest one. And I draw from the front of the plate where the numbers are printed to the back of the plate where there are no numbers, because these holes are actually shaped so that they are larger at the beginning and smaller in the back, so that it makes it just that little bit easier to draw the wire through the draw plate. So I just went through 9/16, now it's time for 1/2 inch. And each time you go through, you'll see it's a little bit harder, but that weave is condensing, it's compressing, it's becoming more even, and it's also work hardening. The more times we work this wire, the more times we put this wire through any sort of motion, it's going to work harden it. So whereas we started with some nice dead soft artistic wire, once we get to the end, we're going to have a nice piece of jewelry that's going to be very durable. And you can see I pull it through each of the holes between 2, 3, maybe 4 times, just so when I'm feeling that it's coming through easily. So that first time when I go down to the next biggest is always a little bit of a challenge, right? It's a little bit hard. And then the second and the third time is really what brings everything even. And this is one of my favorite ones. When I go from 3/8 to 5/16 when I'm using that 24 gauge wire, everything is really starting to come together. When you go from 5/16 to 1/4, that's when things for me get a little tougher. It can be done, but usually what I'll do is I will bring in some reinforcements. I'll bring in a chain nose plier to help me pull that wire through. And it might take a little bit of cajoling. It might take a little bit of work on the front end. It will eventually come through. And sometimes I need to use my whole hand to bring it through. But it will come. It will come. And that first time is always the tough one, and then it's much, much easier. So this is about when I need to make the decision. Do I keep trying to go thinner and thinner? Do I go from 1/4 to 7/32? Or do I like the way that this looks now? I really like how it looks at 1/4 inch. I think that it brings the weave together from any challenges that it might have had. And again, I'd like to draw it through that draw plate until there's no resistance. That's how I know all of the wires are in the places that they need to be. And now it is about time to finish this off and add some end caps and a clasp. So when I did my experiment to see if my cord end would fit over it at the 1/4 inch through the draw plate, I realized that it was still a little bit too big. So let's go ahead and bring the piece through the 7/32, and that will be the perfect draw through for my 6mm cord ends. Depending on what cord end you choose, you might need to leave your weave a little bit thicker or go even thinner. But at the 7/32 draw through, this is what the piece is going to look like. It's even more compressed, it's even more perfect, even more work hardened and ready for the next step. When I'm ready to add my cord end, what I'll do is I'll take a slightly thicker wire. I had been working with 24 gauge, but now I'm going to take a piece of 20 gauge wire about 3 inches long. And I'm going to snip that from the spool. And then I will bend it in half. And what I need to do is gather up the ends of the wire, because what we'll do is make a wrapped loop, pull it through the cord end, and make another wrapped loop on the top. So I don't need this piece anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and just snip that off to get it out of the way. And to the best that I can, I'm going to try to thread this wire through as many of the loops as I can. So if I have to do it on one side and then on the other side, I can do that. And sometimes I will bend it around on itself and back through. Again, this is not rocket science. What we're doing is we are making a wire wrap to pull through our cord end so that we can attach our clasp. So now I have these two wires here, and I'm going to bend one down and one up at 90 degrees. And I might need to come in here with my pliers and just kind of get everything closer together, because again, all of this needs to fit inside of my cord end. Now that I have everything nice and compressed, I'm just going to take one of the wires and bend it around the other once and twice. And I'm going to go ahead and snip that off and tuck my end in. Then I'll take my 6mm cord end over that wire and make sure that everything is nice and tucked in and in place. If for some reason this does not fit onto your bead cap, go ahead and take the draw plate and run it through again until it does. Now all I need to do is take my round nose pliers, make a nice wrapped loop here on the top. If I'd like to add a bead, I can do that at this step, but it's not necessary. And make a nice wrapped loop on top here. I want to make sure that there's no extra space here between my loop and the cord end, and I'll go ahead, snip it off, tuck in the end, and then I need to do that on the other side. Now, of course, I still have my starter piece over here on the other side, so I need to go ahead and snip that off. Again, just with the cutters, and this is also a good time to make sure that your piece isn't too long. If it's too long, all you need to do is go ahead and snip these wires. Because it is wire and not yarn or thread or even bead stringing wire, nothing will unravel. So you can snip as many or as few of these loops off as you need to make the bracelet the size that you need it to be. Just like we did on the other side, we'll come over here, snip off a piece of wire a couple of inches long, fold it in half, and gather up those loops. Now you'll have some little ends here from what we just snipped off. So you can go in and pull them out with your pliers if you need to. But if they're not coming, they probably are in there for good, so I wouldn't even worry about it. Just make sure that you pick up the actual loops with that wire, because that is what is going to secure and hold your bracelet into place. So once again, I am bending this wire around and picking up as many of those loops as you can. If you only get 5 of the 6 loops, don't fret. It's just a way of bringing everything together so that you can attach your clasp and it is nice and secure. Once again, I'm going to wrap this around a couple times to secure it here. Snip off the end and tuck it in. And add my cord end. You could glue these into a cord end if your cord end didn't have a hole in the top. That is an easy way of using different types of cord ends to finish off Viking knit. And because this The wires got a little bit flayed out. Just using my thumbnail to make sure that they are captured inside of that cord end and there's no space. Once again, I'm going to take my round nose pliers, come over here at the top and make a nice wrapped loop to finish everything off. And I always try to remember to tuck in my cord ends for a nice, neat finish. Now the last thing we need to do is add a clasp. So here's my clasp. I'm going to grab a jump ring for the other side and a jump ring to attach the clasp. To attach the clasp, you will use 2 flat nose pliers to open a jump ring. Attach the clasp on one end. Wiggle the ring back and forth to close it. And then attach another jump ring on the other side for the other half of the clasp. The very last step is use your fingers or a bracelet bending pliers just to give a nice curved shape to that Viking knit. This is the last step in work hardening that bracelet so that it is durable and lasts a lifetime. And with just a couple of tools, 2 dowels, 1 draw plate, some 24, 26, or 28 gauge dead soft wire, and a beading awl, you can make a beautiful Viking knit piece, either as a bracelet or as a wonderful necklace to showcase a wire worked cabochon or a beaded design.